All right, 1 Samuel chapter 1 as we start a new book here. This is exciting. Look at verse 23. I think this verse is a key to the entire books. If you look at verse 23, 1:23, it says, "And Elkanah her husband said unto her, Do what seemeth thee good, tarry until thou have weaned him, only the Lord establish his word." And that's the thought. Why are we reading this account? Because the Lord wanted to establish His Word. The books of Samuel that we're going to begin here was for the purpose of establishing God's Word. It was inspired by God. It was written down to become this eternal testimony. It's forever, O Lord, how does he say it? Thy word is settled in heaven. I want you to understand the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel. It's established on earth, and as much as the devil tries to delete it and erase it and burn it, he can't. It's also finished and established in heaven, and the people that are in heaven today can read this very account. This is something we may look back on when we're with the Lord. So just keep that in mind. His Word has purpose, and the Lord wants to establish His Word, and I think we need to have great trust and confidence in His Word. We're going to see the purpose of this particular chapter in that Hannah prayed to God. She made a vow unto God, which is a big promise. God heard her and answered, and He established His Word. He brought it all forth. He got the glory out of the whole situation. The application for us is to consider the things on your to-do list, or better than that, your prayer list. I don't mean the big one that we just went through. I mean your short list, the things that as often as you can, you cry out unto the Lord. Maybe not even audibly. Lord, I need some help with this situation. I want you to know that there is a God in heaven that hears. There is a God that will answer your prayer. And I want to look at how it worked out for Hannah. A woman that was extremely distressed and had a lot of problems. She brought her petitions to the Lord, and God granted them for her. We'll see more next week as we get into chapter 2 and her song, her prayer and answer. But today let's just look at chapter number 1. So the first couple verses we see it introduces Elkanah, that's Hannah's husband. It introduces Hannah, Peninnah, the other wife, which there's your problem. Don't have two wives. Oh man, just about every story with multiple wives ends up with problems. That's pretty obvious. We can see that. So Hannah didn't have children. She did. She was giving her a hard time. And before I go any further in this, I just have to ask this question. Who opens the womb? Well, no, isn't it the fertility doctor? Isn't it the scientists in a lab? No. God opens the womb. God alone opens the womb. Let me give you a couple facts. We just read through Genesis over the past year as we went through that story. In Genesis 11, but Sarah was barren and had no child. Now, she eventually did. It was the Lord's timing. She was after 90. She was past 90 when she did have one. Genesis 20, the Lord had fast closed up all the wombs of the house of Abimelech. God closes and opens the womb. Genesis 29, it says, and when the Lord saw that Leah was hated, He opened her womb, but Rachel was barren. The next chapter in Genesis 30, it says, and Jacob's anger was kindled against Rachel, and he said, Am I in God's stead? Who hath withheld from thee the fruit of the womb? Who hath withheld? God was withholding from her the fruit of the womb. Why? Well, that's His choice, and we don't always get the why. We can on these stories where we get to see their whole life summed up into a chapter or two, which ought to make us consider, if I get a chapter of life, what's it going to say from beginning to end as it spans my entire life every day? In Genesis 30, that same chapter, it says, and God remembered Rachel, and God hearkened to her and opened her womb. As we ended Genesis, we heard of the blessings of the breasts and the blessings of the womb, which is God's promise or fulfillment of a safe and healthy childbirth. And listen, that is from the Lord. And I know it doesn't always happen, but when it does, we must say this is from the Lord, the ability to bear a child and feed a child and nourish a child and train up a child. These are gifts from God, and we should not diminish them or ignore them. There were several women in the Bible that prayed for a child, specifically a son, and they did receive it. Sarah would have been the first. Rachel, Leah, the Shunammite woman, Elizabeth in the New Testament, and tonight we're going to hear about Hannah and her prayer request for a son. With this, let us learn how to trust God through hard times to see His glory as we go through hard times. If we only knew what was at the end of our difficult days, it would help us more. And that's my prayer for you, is that you would get this vision, that we can see Hannah's story. We see the day of her rejoicing, but we also see the day when she's miserable and broken in spirit. And when you're broken in spirit and down and discouraged, I want you to remember God has an awesome opportunity for me at the end of this all. So just don't give up. We have to bring it to the Lord. Look at 1 Samuel 1. Look at verse number 3. And this man went up out of his city yearly to worship and to sacrifice unto the Lord of hosts in Shiloh. And the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, the priests of the Lord, were there. And when the time was that Elkanah offered, he gave to Peninnah, his wife, and all her sons and her daughters portions. Now these are to offer sacrifice unto the Lord. Verse 5, but unto Hannah he gave a worthy portion. It's like she got a double portion. For he loved Hannah, but the Lord had shut up her womb. Well, why? Well, it doesn't say. But I want to know. Now, it was her instinct to want to bear kids. God gives us that. Those that don't have natural affection reject that. Obviously, God doesn't give children to everybody, but I think God puts that in our programming. Look at verse 6. And her adversary also provoked her sore. Now, an adversary is an enemy. The name Satan means adversary. The name devil, that title, means adversary. You have to understand this. This woman, Peninnah, represents a satanic attack. You could say it represents a satanic influence. The Bible does not specifically say that whether she is saved or not. My humble opinion is, as we get into chapter 2, the things that she says, she calls her the Lord's enemy. I think she's alluding to that Elkanah had two wives, one was saved and one was not saved. It seems like the unsaved one had the blessings of the womb and the saved one did not. But God knows how to justify and give victory in the end. Looking there again in verse 6, he says, and her adversary also provoked her sore, for to make her fret, because the Lord had shut up her womb. And that's exactly what an enemy is going to do. They're going to come to you and mock you and cause you to fear because of what you don't have or because of what you're going through. That truly is the will of God at this time in your life, and your enemy wants to throw it in your face. Oh, you're not married yet. You'll never find a spouse. Oh, you don't have a kid yet. Oh, you don't have a son. Oh, you don't have a husband. Oh, you don't have a job. Who knows? Whatever. You don't have a great house. The enemy, Satan, wants to cause you to fret and be afraid and to stumble at things that, frankly, if you're saved, if you're a Christian, they are things that God is allowing in your life to help you to grow. Or to punish you. It could go either way. We don't always know while we're in the midst of it. It's important for us to humble ourselves and seek the Lord's will. Lord, is it me? Have I done something wrong? And if not, then just continue to petition the Lord. Yeah. What if God came to you and put you in the same situation? Think about it. We want to know what's happening to Hannah. Why is He allowing it to happen? Why does He let difficult things happen to us in our life? We've used the example of steel and glass and many other products that has to be hardened by fire and pressure. It has to, or it's worthless. It has to be hardened by these difficult things. Why does God let us go through difficult times? Well, number one, it's for His glory. It's always for His glory, ultimately in the end. Number two, to help us to learn to rely on Him more. Why does God let us go through hard times? So that we learn to just trust Him in every situation. Even when you run out of gas. Even when you get a flat tire. Even when something seemingly goes bad. You say, well, you know what? God's going to use this one way. I don't know how, but I have faith in Him. I'm relying on Him. Another reason is to help us to learn how to help others. That's a hard one. Lord, why do I have to suffer this way? Because 10 other people are, and I want you to minister to them, and you haven't met them yet, and right now it's your day to suffer. So you can go to them and say, I've suffered, and I've received victory from the Lord, and perhaps there's souls that you can get saved because you've suffered affliction in the flesh. Yeah. The hardest reason, though, number 4, my fourth point on that, on why God allows it, It's because He loves us. We believe Romans 8:28, don't we? We know He works all things for good. We love Him, He loves us, and we're not promised everything in this life. What if God came to you and said, I need you to suffer now, today, here, for a while, for my glory? Would we answer and obey, or would we negotiate? Well, Lord, I mean, what about just for a couple days? not both of my arms, Lord. What about just one? Take my left arm. I barely use it anyway. Would we want to kind of barter? No. I need you to suffer, and I need you to do it for my glory, and I've got something great for you when you get through it. It doesn't always happen that way. What if God allows you to go through these situations because He really wants you to appreciate what He is about to give you in the near future, so He makes you go without it until you really appreciate Him, and that He gets the glory, and that how good He is even when you have nothing, and then when He gives it to you, it's like you've been through that rainy day and finally some sunlight comes out. I think sometimes He uses those opportunities for us to grow. Look at verse 7, 1 Samuel 1, verse number 7. And as he did so year by year, when she went up to the house of the Lord, so she provoked her. So therefore she wept and did not eat. Sometimes when somebody won't eat, that's evidence of troubles going on in their mind. She was so troubled, she was crying, and then she was withholding food because those negative, nasty words were like bombs going into her ears and down into her heart. Listen, sometimes when people start throwing this stuff at you, you just say, silence your mouth. I don't want to hear it. You drive yourself away, right? But this adversary was putting thoughts and curses out of her mouth that would into her ears, down her heart with this negativity. And she's like, oh, why? What's the point? What am I going to do? And then she's all troubled, and she begins to recycle those negative thoughts around in her heart, right? And so much she's weeping, and she's not eating. Verse 8, then said Elkanah, her husband, to her, Hannah, why weepest thou? And why eatest thou not? And why is thy heart grieved? Am not I better to thee than 10 sons? Now apparently here he was ignorant of the drama between his wives. I have to ask, was it willfully ignorant? I mean, was he really completely unaware of it, or was he just kind of throwing that question out there like, oh, what's going on? What's the big deal? We don't know. We're not given that indication. We'll see. He's a good guy, and he does things for the Lord, but it blows my mind that he doesn't know. But again, you know, if he's out in the field and they're in the houses and they're striving and he comes home and the other one pretends like, oh, everything's fine. I mean, you could see how others can cause strife that someone is unaware of. Verse number 9, so Hannah rose up after they had eaten in Shiloh, and after they had drunk, now Eli the priest sat upon a seat by a post of the temple of the door. We'll see more about Eli and his sons next week, but here's our introduction to Eli, and he's just sitting. You know, we'll see later, he's kind of a big guy. That's all he does is sit around, and he doesn't get up when he needs to. And anyway, we'll learn more about Eli in a week or two. Let's see, verse number 10. And she, this is Hannah, was in bitterness of soul, and prayed unto the Lord, and wept sore. When we get to this point of bitterness of soul, we got to go to the Lord. It's good. She gives us a great example of a woman. She goes to the Lord to solve her problems. She didn't take matters into her own hands. And we need to remember that. She was weeping sore, bitterness and sore. And you know, that old saying, did you think to pray? I mean, do we really take it to the Lord in prayer? Do we really? Do we make that our priority? I mean, do we fast for an hour or pray for a minute? Do we really take the time to make it such a priority? I mean, I think we should pray until we hurt instead of waiting until we hurt and then finally go pray. Now, she was in that situation. She was hurting. She prayed to the Lord. She went straight to Him. This had obviously gone on for some time. Look at verse 11. In 1 Samuel 1, verse 11, and she vowed a vow and said, oh, Lord of hosts. Now, I want to stop here for a second. Hannah is vowing a vow. A vow is a big deal. This is a promise. You are forswearing yourself. I promise I'm going to do this. I'm making an oath. Write it down. This is a big deal. In fact, go to Matthew chapter 5. I want to give you 5 fives about swearing. I want to give you 5 places found in chapter 5 about making promises and the warning that God gives us with it. In Leviticus 5 it says, if a soul swear, pronouncing with his lips to do evil or to do good, whatever it be that man shall pronounce with an oath, and it be hid from him when he knoweth of it, then he shall be guilty in one of these. What he's saying is, in Leviticus 5 verse 4, if you've sworn to do something and then you forgot about it, when you find out about it, you better do it. This is why it's very important not to make threatening statements. If you do it again, I'm going to whoop your tail. And it's like, really? Because now you're swearing to do good or evil. It's also, oh, kids, I promise, clean up your room, we'll go out for ice cream. What happened, Dad? I changed my mind. We have to be very careful about our words. We want to be true to our word and be sure in what we say. That was Leviticus 5. You're in Matthew 5. Find verse number 33. I'm giving you 5 places, all in chapter 5s, about forswearing. Look at verse 33. Ye have heard that it hath been said by them of old time, thou shalt not forswear thyself, but shall perform unto the Lord thine oaths. But I say unto you, swear not at all, neither by heaven, for it is God's throne. What he's saying is, you heard it was said, don't swear. In fact, it's better, don't even swear at all. If you swear something, you better do it. And the best way to avoid that is to just don't make promises whatsoever. Be careful making promises, listen, especially to God. Go to Ecclesiastes chapter 5. Go to Ecclesiastes chapter 5. It's better not to swear. In James 5, verse 12, he says, but above all things, my brethren, swear not, neither by heaven, neither by the earth, neither by any other oath, but let your yea be yea, and your nay, nay, lest ye fall into condemnation. Now, just say yes or no. Don't say yes, I promise, I swear on my mama's grave, on somebody's head, on my house, any of that weird stuff. People use these sayings and they really ought not to do it. And most of the time people will swear, they take God's name included in it, and they exaggerate things, and they blow it out of proportion, and you say things that aren't true, and really when God looks at it, he's like, I'm not satisfied with what you just did. I heard a guy one time, and they were talking about, it was a brand new parking lot, and a car drove over a piece of bubble gum, and you saw this bubble gum literally stretch the distance from where it was anchored, all across. I mean, it went quite a distance. That's the safest way to say it. But the guy, and I saw it, and he's saying, I swear it must have been a mile, or something along those lines. And it's like, now wait a minute, what do we do? Do we have this tendency in our human nature is, I promise, and then I exaggerate? Sometimes that's paired together. If you'll listen to the words that other people use, they've come to this habit of saying, I promise, I swear, it was, and then they exaggerate. Let your yea be yea, and your nay be. It was really wild. It went quite a distance, maybe a few car lengths, I don't know. That's a safe way to say it. It's quite a spectacle, but not worth swearing and lying. It wasn't their intention. However, it was their habit. It was their habit, and this is what we have to be cautious of. You're in Ecclesiastes chapter 5, look at verse number 2. Be not rash with thy mouth, and let not thine heart be hasty to utter anything before God. This is so important. Listen, keep your mouth under control. Keep your spirit under control. Put a guard over your mouth. Don't say things that you don't mean. Don't exaggerate things just for attention. This can be a very bad thing. Sometimes you might just get what you want, or what you thought you want, or what you thought was worth saying. Be not rash with thy mouth, and let not thine heart be hasty to utter anything before God. For God is in heaven, and thou art upon the earth, therefore let thy words be few, especially before God. This is why we don't have an altar call in our church. Now listen, if we ever did have a moment of decision to encourage you to get on your knees in your seat and pray unto the Lord, there's nothing wrong with that. But I've been in churches where every single service, they say the same thing, they play the same song, and the same people come down, and they swear unto God again, they say the same thing. And we got to be real careful about that. Lord, I promise I'll never do it again. Well, there you go. You're swearing. You're forswearing. Where here he says, look at verse 2, he says, at the end, let thy words be few. Don't be hasty to utter something, especially to God. He knows your heart, both good and evil. He knows what you're capable of. And considering that, and you can just say, Lord, you know my heart, and I struggle, and I want to conquer this, and I want to give you the glory in this area of my life. But don't get up there and say, I swear I'll never do it again. Lord, just give me that job, and I'll tithe 20%. And then you get it, and it's like, oh, I forgot. We got to be careful what we say. Look at verse 3. For a dream cometh through the multitude of business, and a fool's voice is known by a multitude of words. Isn't that the truth? The guy at the job that talks more than anybody else, you know, this guy's the fool, right? Verse 4, when thou vowest a vow unto God, defer not to pay it, for he hath no pleasure in fools. Pay that which thou vowed. If you say something, you better do it. So therefore, just be really careful what you say to God. Verse 5, better is it that thou shouldest not vow than that thou shouldest vow and not pay. Suffer not thy mouth to cause thy flesh to sin. You understand what he's saying? Your mouth can get your body in trouble. Suffer not thy mouth to cause thy flesh to sin. Neither say thou before the angel that it was an error. Wherefore should God be angry at thy voice and destroy the work of thine hands? He says God will judge you and destroy what you're doing if you're saying things that you don't mean or promising God things that you're not going to fulfill. Go back to 1 Samuel 1 if you would. One last chapter 5, in Nehemiah 5 it says, then I called the priest and took an oath to them that they should do according to the promise. When you make a promise, you should do according to it. You make an oath. He says in a few verses later, also I shook my lap and said, so God shall shake out every man from his house and from his labor that performeth not this promise. He took it and he goes, that's what God's going to do to you. He's going to shake you out and destroy you if you make him a promise and then don't keep it. It's a big deal. I'm just showing you 5 places in chapter 5s that tell us not to forswear, to be careful about promising. And let me give you 5 people that made promises that failed. Jacob. He told Laban, whoever in the house has the false gods, let him not live. Oh, he didn't know it was Rachel. Good thing Laban didn't find them. Joseph's brothers, whenever Joseph's soldiers came and caught them, and they said, who has the money and the cup in their sack? And they said, whoever it is, they should die. They didn't know it was Benjamin, but they forswore themselves. How about Jephthah when he swore to burn whatever came out of his gate when he came home after his great victory? He didn't know it would be his only daughter, and God didn't require that of him. More importantly, when you say something, if God's not requiring it, make your words few. Make them few. How about Saul? He made an oath to kill even his son if he found out who had eaten anything that day. And lo and behold, it was his son Jonathan that had not heard, and he dipped his rod in the honey and ate it. How about Peter when he denied the Lord Jesus Christ by an oath and then began to curse? It's very important for us to be afraid of an oath, a promise, for swearing. You've been warned. In fact, I would encourage you to pray at some point in your life, maybe tonight, maybe tomorrow, maybe right now as you're listening to me, tune me out and start talking to the Lord and say, Lord, have I forgotten a vow? Lord, if I have forgotten a vow, forgive me and help me to remember it and help me to be true to my words as you are always to me. If we've forgotten a vow, the moment we find out, we're liable. We need to deal with it. Now, all of that being said, we come back to this story in verse number 11, where Hannah is troubled, distressed, and she comes to the Lord. She's going to vow a vow, and I want to remind you, if you need help, you can call on the Lord and make a vow to Him. But be very careful. Just know that it should cost you whatever you say. Look at verse 11. It says, and she vowed a vow and said, O Lord of hosts, if thou wilt indeed look on the affliction of thine handmaid, and remember me, and not forget thine handmaid, but will give unto thy handmaid a man-child. So if you look and give me, then I will give him unto the Lord all the days of his life, and there shall no razor come upon his head. Her promise was this: I've had no children, my adversary is provoking me, it troubles my heart so bad. Lord, I know you're the one that's closed my womb. Lord, would you open my womb? Would you give me a child? If you give me a man, I'll give him to you. I'll raise him up for your service for the rest of his life. It's a bold promise. She was a woman of honor. She was an honorable woman, and she made this vow, and she kept it. We'll see that. Notice at the end, just a little fact that says, and there shall no razor come upon his head. She's referring to the Nazirite vow that you would see in Numbers chapter 6, where they don't eat anything from the fruit of the vine. Vinegar, vinegar, comes from the vine. Wine, grapes, moist or dried, liquors. It gives a whole list of things. And then it also talks that there would be no razor on their head. You also probably remember Samson. His parents made that same vow with Samson. Now, he didn't, Samson was too weak to keep his strength, right? He was too spiritually weak. We also see that the Apostle Paul made this vow in the New Testament, and he was going to keep it. He went back to Jerusalem, and everybody tried to warn him, don't go, but he did. He kept it. The Lord still used it. Verse number 12. And it came to pass, as she continued praying before the Lord, that Eli marked her mouth. So she's praying, she's saying, and he comes up and he possibly marks it with a marker. I mean, not a marker, like a piece of chalk, or maybe a coal out of the fire. Or maybe it's just talking about he's touching her, like marking it, like making the statement, I've marked you, like you're doing something, right? Verse 13, now Hannah, she spake in her heart, only her lips moved, but her voice was not heard. Therefore Eli thought she had been drunken. Now, she was very vexed, and she was praying fast. She had a lot on her mind, and she was saying it probably over and over and over, right? And so he's thinking, what is this woman doing? Look at it, just, and not saying a thing, right? And Eli said unto her, how long wilt thou be drunken? Verse 14, how long wilt thou be drunken? Why is he thinking that? Put away thy wine from thee. And Hannah answered and said, no, my Lord, I am a woman of a sorrowful spirit. I have drunk neither wine nor strong drink, but have poured out my soul before the Lord. Count not thy handmaiden for a daughter of Belial. You know what she just said there? Oh, no. I'm not a drunk like the children of the devil who just live for drinking and lasciviousness. Please don't mistake me for a child of the devil by my actions. I know there are drunks that will make it to heaven, but no Christian ought to look like a drunk. We've been delivered from such things. He says, count not thy handmaid for a daughter of Belial, for out of the abundance of my complaint and grief have I spoken hitherto. Then Eli answered and said, go in peace, and the God of Israel grant thee thy petition that thou hast asked of him. Now Eli had some problems, but he was saved, and God uses him still to speak. Something to consider. Verse 18, and she said, let thine handmaid find grace in thy sight. That's actually what Hannah means. That's her name. It means grace or mercy. And let me find grace. Hey, just like Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord, so did Hannah, right? Let thine handmaid find grace in thy sight. So the woman went her way and did eat, and her countenance was no more sad. All it took was the priest of the Lord answering on behalf of the Lord. Hey, he'll give whatever you said. You got it. Whatever your request was, it's been answered. The Lord will grant it to you. She says, oh, let me find some grace. She relieved it. She was relieved. She received the answer immediately. She trusted it. She believed that she had received, and she went away trusting that the Lord would provide. She wasn't sad anymore. Verse 19, and they rose up in the morning early and worshiped before the Lord and returned and came into their house to Ramah. And Elkanah knew Hannah his wife, and the Lord remembered her. Wherefore it came to pass, when the time was come, about after Hannah had conceived, that she bare a son and called his name Samuel, saying, because I have asked of him of the Lord. That's what his name means, is basically, God heard me. I asked, he gave it. Verse 21, and the man Elkanah and all his house went up to offer unto the Lord the yearly sacrifice and his vow. Notice the family was a family of vows unto the Lord. And she made one extra. Verse 22, but Hannah went not up, for she said unto her husband, I will not go up until the child be weaned. And then I will bring him, that he may appear before the Lord, and there abide forever. And Elkanah her husband said unto her, do what seemeth thee good. Tarry until thou have weaned him. Only the Lord establish his word. So the woman abode and gave her son suck until she weaned him. I think what he is saying, Elkanah is saying, now keep your word. God has kept His word. Now you keep your word. Let it all come to pass. I think at this point, Dad probably understood that there was a greater purpose for this child, that the Lord's hand was on it. And listen, children, we have something to look forward to. God has these promises for every generation. He wants to give you this kind of a blessing and this kind of a portion. He wants to raise up Samuel at a time when the priests were corrupt, and the word of the Lord was precious, it couldn't be found. He was going to raise up this young man from birth to be used for God. Look at verse 24. And when she had weaned him, she took him up with her with 3 bullocks, and 1 ephah of flour, and a bottle of wine, and brought him unto the house of the Lord in Shiloh. And the child was young. Notice it doesn't say he's a baby. It does say he's young. I wonder why 3 bullocks. That's more than the standard sacrifice. Maybe she's saying, and here's some food for the year. I'm sending him with snacks, you know. Here's my son. Don't worry, he's going to eat you out of house and home. I brought a couple extra, some beef jerky, all right? Verse 25, and they slew a bullock and brought the child to Eli. And she said, oh, my Lord, as thy soul liveth, my Lord, I am the woman that stood by thee here, praying unto the Lord. Now that's a praise report. Hey, I'm the woman that had a prayer. I needed a miracle that only God can answer, and He gave it to me. That's me. I'm back. And I have a sacrifice. I have my son. Verse 27, for this child I prayed, and the Lord hath given me my petition, which I asked of Him. Therefore also I have lent him to the Lord. As long as he liveth, he shall be lent to the Lord, and he worshiped the Lord there. Do you see that? And we're done. He, Samuel, from a young age, began worshiping the Lord. We're not told how old he is. We're not told how long she gave him suck, but she did for a while, that he could stand on his own 2 feet and function. I don't think it's a good idea to take a 2-year-old. My opinion, my theory is he was older than 2. A lot of people say, oh, you don't breastfeed after 2. I don't know. He was able to worship the Lord, kind of take care of himself. It wasn't dependent upon Eli. Nonetheless, whatever age that was, she made enough of an impact as a good, godly mom, training this young man, hey, I'm raising you to serve God. This is your purpose, to serve God. I love you and I want you more than anything in this world, but I'm giving you to God because God gave you to me and I must give you back. That was my vow. That was my promise. She taught him to be a man of His word. Let's pray. Lord, we see this story of this woman that was provoked and wept sore and did not eat. Her heart was grieved. Lord, she was in bitterness of soul and she prayed to you. Lord, we see that she made a vow, a promise. And Lord, you helped her. You answered. You gave her her petition. Lord, if there's somebody here tonight that wants to take hold of your ear and ask for a big favor, I ask that you would please hear them. Lord, I ask that you would help them. Lord, I pray that you would help us to count the cost when we make promises to you. And Lord, help us to keep our word. Lord, we want you to establish your word in our life. Lord, if you want our children to be your servants for life, they're yours. You can have them. Lord, do you want me? Do you want us? Lord, I ask that you would help us to see our true purpose in life. I ask that you would help us to take our life and to make it count for you. Lord, I ask that you would help us to be mighty in the Spirit for your glory. And help us to realize that when we're down and depressed and discouraged and beat up by this world and our adversaries, that you will always hear our cry. Lord, I pray that you would help us to pray with the power of the Holy Spirit. We ask this in Jesus' name.